Hi, Circe. Would you like to tell us a little bit about who you are and what your role is with AQA, please?
Okay, so my name's Circe Newbold, and I've been a senior examiner for AQA for 19 years. Um, Paper one, research methods and education, is the paper I know really well. But for the last 2 years, I've also been examining paper three. Last summer as an examiner, and this summer they've asked me to be a senior examiner for paper three as well.
Fantastic. That's a lot of experience there, Circe. And
Yeah.
we're gonna talk about paper one to start with. So, what's your general sort of do's and don'ts for students on the paper one?
I think it's hard to answer that question by itself, but my main thing I would say is it's really important to keep an eye on the time. Don't rush through the paper and spend a decent amount of time on the short questions because those should be an easy 10 marks. And out of 80, 10 marks can make quite a big difference between grade A star and a grade C.
Yeah, and just thinking about those short mark questions, what is your advice in terms of how to set them out and structure them?
So I would set them out in bullet points. Definitely keep them separate from each other, but don't write too little. So it's really important that you answer the question. And I think the word outline is actually a bit misleading. I think it should really say outline and explain because that's what they want. Not as big an explanation as the 10-mark question, but actually, so I've thought of an example. So for example, if it was two external reasons why working class pupils underachieve, one reason could be lack of parental interest, and that would be your 1 mark. But to get the 2nd mark, you need to explain why that causes the pupil to underachieve. So, not getting support with homework or not having a parent who sort of checks in and supports them. So, I would say definitely bullet point them, keep them separate. If you're not sure about the answer, put another answer down. That's always good advice.
Good. And what if the student does put more than two or more than three?
They sometimes do. I mean, sometimes I've read a paper where they could have maybe got 8 marks. If the first one's wrong, they'll credit the two that are correct. So there's nothing wrong with putting more than two answers down.
Good, as long as you're not spending ages and ages on it, I guess.
Well, yeah, of course. I mean, I think those first two questions you've got about 10 or 15 minutes.
Yeah. And then moving on to the next questions, question three and four, obviously item questions. Some students struggle a little bit with that. So what's your advice on the extent to which students should use and refer to the items?
So question three, you must use the item twice. You must use the item twice. If you don't, you get 3 marks out of 10, even if you've written a page. So on question three, it's very, very important. It's very restricted. Use the item. My advice is start each paragraph with the item. Underline the item if necessary. Make it very, very clear that you're using the item. The person marking your paper isn't going to search for the item. Don't make them look for it. Make sure you use it. And then obviously develop the item link into an answer to the question. And you need to do that twice.
Right. And for the question four?
For question four, it's less important. And actually, I would say item lifting, where the beginning of the essay starts with the whole item copied out. That's not very impressive. Sometimes the examiner, if they've marked loads of papers, and I think I've done this myself, you start reading it and you're like, wow, that's very impressive. Oh, it's the item.
Yeah.
So don't use it like that. But what I would say to my students is use the item as a plan for your answer. The item is a scaffold for your answer in question four, because it lays out the debate in 5 or 6 or 7 lines. So yes, you should incorporate it into your answer, but as a way to develop it. I might start the essay with the item, but not the whole item, just like one sentence out of the item.
Yeah.
In question four, the item is a plan. In question three, it's compulsory that you use the item.
Right. And for question four, you need to use the item to get to the very top, do you?
Well, I mean, if the answer's really good, we will look for reference to the item, and it could be implicit reference. So you can get 30 out of 30 without making a direct link to the item.
Great.
If it's that good.
If it's that good, that's good to know. And then for question five, I think it's often quite quite a weak answer for many students. So what's your advice to gain a top boundary mark for this question?
So question 5, I mean, I really like methods in context. I think it gives students the opportunity to really show their application skills. It is difficult though, and I think this is probably where being an examiner massively advantages my students, because I know what a really good methods in context answer looks like and what one that isn't so good looks like. Don't need any studies, don't need any theory. It's all about application. So it's quite hard to revise for this question because you don't know what the issue is going to be, but you can revise for the possible context type questions. So for example, you can plan things like getting into a school, getting access to parents, issues around children. You can make some sort of assumptions about children that they might not have great literacy skills. They might be intimidated by a middle-class researcher. They might not want to admit that they're underachieving. And those are general assumptions. So if, for example, that the method is primary method like interviews, those could be weaknesses. So how to talk to children could be a problem. If, on the other hand, the method was something like questionnaires, you could turn that into a strength. So the children don't have to sit in front of a researcher, therefore they might be more likely to be honest. But really, it's not about how much you write. I mean, I've seen answers that are maybe 6, 7 paragraphs got full marks because every paragraph is directly linked to the topic and the context. That's the most important thing with that question.
And talking about that link, so we often see papers where the student's just written a methods answer with no direct links at all. So what's the maximum they can gain if they do that?
It has to be really, really excellent methods knowledge, and then it could get up to 12, but no more than 12.
Yeah, even if it's fantastic.
Yeah.
Good, excellent.
I mean,
then
that question isn't really about methods. It's about application. That's the most important thing that question is looking for.
Yeah, thank you. And then moving on to the final question, it's another 10 marker. Students often muddle the structure with question 3. So can you just explain the difference for students, please?
No evaluation required for that question. Evaluation will not get you any marks. In fact, I would say you probably lose marks because you write less. That's actually relevant. So it's a bit tricky because what that question does is it takes 2 separate points from the specification and puts them together in a way which might not seem easy to understand. So I think there was 2 ethical issues with primary quantitative methods. So on one side, you've got ethical issues, which is factors affecting the choice of method. On the other side, you've got primary quantitative methods. So, I mean, the idea is to think of an ethical issue, or an issue, in this case, deception, explain why it's an ethical issue, link it to a primary quantitative method. Experiments would be a good example of that. And ideally, have a study which demonstrates that issue. If you can't think of a study, try and think of an example when that might be an issue. And basically, you have to do that twice.
Right. And that was going to be my final question, actually. Does that limit you from getting top marks if you don't have a study in there?
You might get to 10 marks without a study, but I think it partly depends on what the question is. Because those questions can really vary because they could be methods or they could be theory. So like before this, but I think a couple of years ago, it was 2 criticisms of the functionalist perspective.
Yeah.
And that can sometimes throw students a bit because they're expecting it to be research methods.
Yeah.
I think to get 10, there probably would have to be a study or a really good theory reference.
Circe, thank you very much for advice on paper 1. Thank you.